So the last week, we started out talking about why we believe in anything at all. And this week, we're going to talk about a moral cause, why we need a transcendent God in order to have objective morality. Next week, we're going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which I'm really excited about because that's really what it all hinges on for us tonight. So we'll start by talking about why God, a moral cause. Before I begin, I just wanted to say that the reason that I think this is important is not because necessarily that most of you were students or are students or in that field, but that these are questions that are being asked on a daily basis by at least my colleagues, my coworkers. I'm sure a lot of your coworkers and your colleagues as well, and I think that they're important issues that we need to address and be able to shed some light on them. Mr. Frederick, I love his last name. I'm actually really amazing at pronouncing it. That's a joke, by the way. I'm terrible at saying it. I'm going to try here. Shane tried to help me, so I'm going to say that it's Friedrich Nietzsche. There we go, Friedrich Nietzsche. He says, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, it does not exist." I think a common expression that we would hear on the street, something that would go along this line, I'm sure you've heard it before. It goes like this: you do you. You do you, I'll do me. What's right for you is right for you, that's cool. What I do is right for me, that's fine. Don't tell me necessarily that what I'm doing is wrong in any way. We'll each sort of have our own perspective, and that's just fine, which is fine if you're going to buy a car. And tonight we're not talking about buying a car or what you want to order at Tim Hortons. Tonight we're talking about morality in a bigger picture. We're talking about things that really matter in terms of life. So this is his perspective. Let's carry on here. So let's ask ourselves a few questions here. Are there some things that are always wrong? Are there some things that are wrong in spite of popular opinion? So now, yeah, you could see some of these things that I've listed here could be fairly extreme, could be fairly obvious that they're wrong. I think that's the point. But when we look at things, we'll talk about torturing of babies for fun, the Indian practice of a widow burning, kind of coming to a close, thankfully, but they're still practiced. Sexual abuse of children by church authorities covering it up, rape, murder of innocent people. Are these things always wrong, or are they just wrong some of the time? Is it objective or is it subjective? Oscar Wilde says, nothing succeeds like excess. Nothing is good or bad, only charming or dull. That's interesting. Nothing is good, nothing is bad, only charming or dull. Question: is this charming or dull or wrong? That's an important question that we need to ask ourselves. You know, we go back and we look at this and we say, obviously that's wrong. I believe this is from a World War II concentration camp. As the Allies came in, they noticed, first of all, they didn't actually believe that it existed because it was beyond comprehension in terms of how brutal it was. But then when they found it, and they started to actually take note and document the extent to which this had taken place, it was beyond comprehension. And so the question is this charming or dull or wrong? Keep in mind that this was completely legal, actually. This was done legally. This was what was done. We're going to get into that just a little bit, but just keep that in the background of the mind as we progress through this. So right and wrong. Few deny that some acts are always morally wrong. This equates to there being objective moral values and duties in life. I'm going to just tease out a little bit what we're talking about between objective morals and duties in just a moment, and values. But I think Louise Anthony, maybe I'm saying that right? This is very interesting. Any argument against the objective reality of moral values will be based on premises that are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values themselves. In other words, objective moral values, knowing what is right and what is wrong, is obvious. To try and say that it's subjective, you have to do a whole lot more philosophical work than just saying it's objective. I want to actually bring a little bit of scripture in tonight. Hopefully that's allowed. We're in a church, so I was told I'm allowed to use the Bible here. But Romans chapter 1, verse 19, if you have a Bible, take a look at what Paul says. Paul is talking here, he's writing to the church at Rome, and he says, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. The in them is people. for God hath showed it unto them. And then if you flip over in my Bible, it's the next page. Maybe in your app it's the slide down or whatever, but Romans chapter 2, verses 14 to 15. This is very interesting. I think it's telling. Paul again writing, he says, for when the Gentiles, that's those that don't have an understanding of the law, and he goes on to say that, for when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves. Verse 15 is very important, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience. That's very key, because right now there's a debate whether or not there is such thing as a conscience, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Paul says that the law has been written on their hearts, their conscience, also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. In other words, it's obvious. And to get around it being obvious, you have to do things that are very challenging. You have to do some mental acrobatics, as it were. Let's define some terms here. Defining some terms: objective, independent of opinion. So, like I had previously mentioned when we looked at the horrifying and grotesque picture there of the concentration camp, the reason I say that is, and to show that, is because it is, although it's on a grand scale, although it is maybe amping it up somewhat, it is still the point, and I think it brings the point home quite well. So, if 51% of the population said rape was right, would it still be wrong? It's a good question. We talk about values, whether something is good or bad, a description of worth, and when we talk about duties, we're talking about the oughtness of what we ought to do. In other words, me, David Super, as a human, what should I do? There's value in terms of life, but then what should I be doing in terms of action? So those are sort of it's a nuanced difference, but it is subtle, but it's yet important. So whether the act is obligatory. So, key ingredients to objective moral values and duties. First thing you need to have a standard. You need to know what is the standard between right and wrong. You have to have a standard. And then secondly, you have to have an authority. Without an authority and without a standard, you can't have objective moral values. It's very simple. If you have Canada is your government of Canada is your authority. You have the criminal code, that is your standard. Without a standard or without authority, you don't have an objective moral value. What I'm saying tonight is that rather than just having it specifically to Canada or America or having a specific culture, there is morality that each one of us knows is right and wrong in spite of having external influences and forces telling us. In other words, you don't need to read the Criminal Code of Canada to know that morality says you shouldn't kill somebody. It's written on your heart. That's the whole point. That's what Paul's talking about in Romans chapter 2. C.S. Lewis says, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. That's very interesting. How would we know what the difference is between a straight line or how would we know that a crooked line is a crooked line unless we had something to compare it against? And so this past week I was talking to a gentleman at work and he said, one of the things is, and we're not going to get into this, but how can there be a good God and how can there be suffering in the world? How can a good God allow suffering? And actually, I don't know if you've ever come across this, but really that's a backhanded argument for the existence of God. Because you see, when we have evil, there is good. Let me explain it this way. A shadow proves the sunshine. You see, you can have the sunshine without a shadow, but you can't have a shadow without the sunshine. Anytime we see a depravity or we see a deprivation of that which is good, we see something and we say, that is wrong. Why do we say it's wrong? We say it's wrong because we know in our hearts, because God has given us a conscience, that what we see is not lining up that what we know should be taking place. And it's obvious. That's why the previous lady said that it's obvious. And you have to do a lot of work to make it not so obvious. So let's look at some possible reasons or some possible places with which we get some morality. I'm just going to flip through a couple of these slides. The universe, culture and society, the individual, and a descendant creator. Obviously tonight, like last week and like next week as well, these are going to be cursory overviews. And I apologize for that, but we're going to jam in as much as we can in the time that we have. And if you'd like any more information, I'd be happy to give some more notes or whatever to you. So examining the options. All right, from the universe, Stephen Crane. A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." "Nevertheless," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me the slightest feeling of obligation." In other words, the universe doesn't really care that you exist. You exist, but why does that matter to something that's impersonal? From a cause-effect standpoint, an effect must represent its cause in essence and nature. How can an amoral, impersonal, meaningless, purposeless universe accidentally create personal, moral beings who are obsessed with meaning and purpose? Obsessed with meaning and purpose. I mean, we are driven with meaning and purpose. You can't have a conversation. I mean, maybe you can, but I mean, I can't get through a week at work or somewhere. It's like, why am I here? Where am I going? And we start to ask these questions that I think are very unique to us as humans, but we start asking some very deep questions, and I think not just Christians, the population around us are asking these as well. As we recently did a little survey of the area, and there were some responses that came back, and not necessarily right into this category, but these are some questions with which people are wrestling with, people in the North End and in Halifax. This isn't something that's strictly academic. This is something that if you went across the street to the park and you started talking and conversing with people, these are questions that could easily come up. So Richard Dawkins says, humans have always wondered about the meaning of life. Life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. Life has no design, no purpose. This is important. No evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. If you'll notice here, he says, there's no greater purpose, there is no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. Oftentimes, especially I had this in a philosophy class, and we were sort of put into different groups of people, and it's like, okay, one person, you're going to be with those three people over there, you're going to be with those three people over there, and here's the question. You're all been in a life raft, you've been in a ship, the ship has gone down, you guys are in your life raft now, and there's 6 people, and your life raft can only help 5 people. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, as a Christian, we look at that and we have to wrestle with that, right? Because we look at life and we say life is important, life has purpose, life comes from God. But question here is, if the highest purpose is to perpetuate the survival of DNA, specifically your DNA or my DNA, then why is this even a discussion? Just kick the person off and keep going. It shouldn't even be a discussion. But I think the reason that it's a discussion is because each one of us intrinsically knows within ourselves that there is a right way and there is a wrong way to look at these things. And so we have an internal struggle. And that struggle is telling us that we do have a conscience. But I want to continue on here and look at some ways we could look at morality from culture. So, in Kenya, the practice of beading is carried out. A close family relative of a young girl places a strand of beads around the young girl's neck. This effectively is a temporary engagement, and the relative can now have sexual relations with her. Some girls are beaded when they are 6 years old. Many girls get pregnant and either have abortions or kill their babies at birth. When they reach adulthood, the girls will marry outside of their villages, but taboo dictates the girls will never be able to marry if they keep the babies resulting from beating. Question: if we get our morality from culture, and this is their culture, is it wrong? See, we can say it's wrong, and a lot of people would say it's wrong. I'm sure if you went down the street and you gave this example and you asked a population and said, is it wrong? I said, yeah, how do you know? Well, because our culture is telling us it's wrong. Question: our culture tells us it's wrong. Their culture tells them it's the thing to do. Is it right or is it wrong? Is there a way of knowing what's right and wrong outside of culture? It's a fair question. If culture is the source of objective morals and duties, then widow burning can be morally acceptable. Cannibalism can be morally acceptable. Murder can be morally acceptable. Unforgiveness and rape can be morally acceptable. Gratuitously torturing innocent babies can be morally acceptable. It was for the Canaanites. If you remember back in the Bible, remember how they would put their kids up there on the altar before Baal, and they would get that idol going really, really hot, and that's exactly what they would do, and it was in their culture. Remember, God came by, and this is interesting. God came by, and he had Israel come and wipe them out. It's always fascinating to me that when we have these discussions, everyone has an objection. What about the Canaanites? Isn't it crazy that, isn't it evil that God would come and do that to the Canaanites? The question then becomes, you're so mad that the Canaanites are doing this, and then God does something to the Canaanites for doing that, and then you're mad at God for doing that. Anyways, it's just a side note, but I think there's a lot of double standards when we sort of boil things down. Let's continue on here. From culture, during the trials at Nuremberg, the Nazi defense attorneys argued that Hitler's soldiers who were on trial were only following the orders of their society and should therefore not be held accountable. In other words, they got told to do this. This was acceptable in their society. This was right in their society, right? They shouldn't be held accountable. And the judge countered that argument with the question, "But sir, is there not a law above our laws?" What's he referring to? Conscience. He's referring to exactly what Paul tells us in Romans chapter 2, that the conscience, that when the Gentiles have a conscience written on their heart, they do the things according to the law, because God has written it there. We need an ultimate authority to appeal in matters that transcend history and culture and society. If we don't have something that transcends history, culture, and society, then we have no way of saying this is right and this is wrong. We can't go back and say that the Canaanites doing this was wrong. Was wrong in terms of torturing their babies. We can't look at somewhere else and say that's wrong. We can't look anywhere except our own culture and tell anybody that they're doing is wrong, if this is the only place that we're going to be getting our morality from. So who is mankind morally obligated to? I would suggest a real moral obligation exists. The question is then to whom? And we need to consider the issue, the reformer's dilemma. How can a culture ever be positively influenced from the outside if the culture is the determiner of good and evil? That's the whole point here. I think from the Western perspective, it's very interesting. We would be horrified. We'd be absolutely horrified by some of the examples that I placed up there. But yet, when we would go, we would say everything is subjective, and then we really undermine our ability to place judgment on something else if it's completely subjective, if culture is the determiner of good and evil. So, we'll carry on here. We'll look at it from an individual's perspective. How do you decide between right or right and wrong? Differing moral opinions of each individual is the ultimate decision maker of what is good or bad. What does that sound like? You do you. I'll do me. Will be completely subjective. Just don't tell me that what I'm doing is right. How does the statement, "For me, rape is wrong, but it might be okay for you" sound? Probably not so great. I don't think if we pushed it that far, we would be able to, people would be very uncomfortable with it. But that's really where it goes to. That's logically the conclusion with which we're going to end up. With individuals, everything boils down to emotion and emotive responses to morals without moral global absolutes. I was talking to a friend this week at work, and he was saying, last year I was having a rough time, etc. I was dating this girl for 5 years, thought I was going to get engaged. Things didn't turn out the way that I wanted them to. Things fell apart. She left me, etc., etc. And I was a complete degenerate for a year and did this, and this. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Who told you that what you were doing was wrong?" I said, "Did the criminal code tell you that what you were doing was wrong?" "Nope." Did you read it somewhere that what you were doing is wrong?" "No, I just felt that what I was doing was wrong. I knew that what I was doing was wrong." Which is interesting. It's exactly what Paul says. Romans 2, we have a conscience, and we do know what's right and wrong. From the individual. In his debate with the atheist Bertrand Russell, anyone heard of Bertrand Russell? Okay, never mind, that's fine. Fairly famous gentleman, but that's besides the point. What he's saying is going to be very important. So in his debate with the atheist Bertrand Russell, the Jesuit and philosopher Frederick Colpson looked at Russell and asked, "Lord Russell, do you believe in good and bad?" Russell replied, "Yes, of course." Colpson continued, "How do you differentiate between good and bad?" Russell replied, the same way I differentiate between blue and green or yellow and green. Colston then said, wait a minute, you differentiate between yellow and green by seeing, don't you? Russell said, yes. So he challenged him by asking, how do you differentiate between good and bad? Now this is important. Russell replied, I differentiate on those matters on the basis of my feelings. What else? What else can you base it on? You know, and the sad reality is that he's being honest. At least he's being honest. A lot of people wouldn't be that honest. A lot of people wouldn't actually come out and say that. But he's saying, listen, I'm being philosophically consistent here, and if I'm going to be logically and philosophically consistent, I have to come to this conclusion. So many people espouse relativism, but they demand absolutes. It's very much a one-way street here. They say everything is relative, and then you go and do something they don't like, and then they immediately judge you for doing something that they don't like, even though it's completely subjective in their mind. So watching how people react to being wronged proves they want and recognize absolute morality. Stealing from a relativist, let them be the victim of false advertising. Watch how they respond when their spouse is relatively faithful to them versus absolutely faithful. And the reaction showcases the recognition of absolute morality. You see, it's a one-way street. We say, everything you do, you. Okay, I'll do me. And what I think is right is for me to punch you. And then as soon as I punch you, that person gets mad and say, shouldn't have done that. Why shouldn't I have done that? Good question. Maybe there is something absolute. So, continuing on this sort of view of things, we're going to look at from the individual, or we'll be continuing looking at the individual. Science cannot tell you if it's right or wrong. For you, this is interesting, by the way. This isn't just like some blogger, who paid $60 for some PhD and just decided that he's going to call himself like Dr. Dawkins. Like, this is a world-renowned guy. This is out of, I think, his book, The God Delusion, I believe. I can double-check that for you. But anyways, he says, science cannot tell you if it's right or wrong for you to eat your own baby's clone. But it can tell you that's what you're actually doing. Then you can decide for yourself if you think it's right or wrong. It's being logically consistent. I know it sounds disgusting because it is disgusting, because he's put himself in a position where he has to philosophically continue down this track. He's just saying, and he's right, it can't tell you if it's right or wrong. It can tell you what it is that you're doing, but not that what you're doing is right or wrong necessarily. It just tells you what you're doing, that's all. Albert Einstein, a few of you may have heard of him before. You are right in speaking of the moral foundations of science, but you cannot turn around and speak of the scientific foundations of morality. Why? It's because what Dawkins says, it tells you what you're doing. It doesn't tell you if what you're doing is right or wrong. Sam Harris, in his book, The Moral Landscape, wrote, the moral landscape is a space of real and potential outcomes whose peaks correspond to heights of potential well-being and whose valleys represent the deepest possible suffering. Questions about values are really questions about the well-being of conscious creatures. Values are really the questions about well-being of conscious creatures. So the well-being is really what we're talking about here. That's what he's arguing for. Let's just examine that for a second. The reason we're talking about Sam Harris is because he's relatively well-known. You go to the library, you're going to find a lot of books from him. I would suspect probably a lot of your friends and coworkers have heard of this guy. Just type in YouTube or whatever, and you're going to find a lot of debates or book reviews by this gentleman. So Harris redefines good to be the flourishing of well-being, or the well-being, of conscious creatures. Harris admits in his book that it is possible that the peak of the moral landscape, okay, because the peak, remember, is something different than we would talk about. He's talking about the well-being of conscious creatures. The peak of the moral landscape could be occupied by flourishing rapists, murderers, and thieves. So he admits it's possible that goodness and creaturely well-being are not identical. Therefore, I think his moral theory really collapses on itself. So, Where does that leave us? We've looked at the universe, we've looked at society, we've looked at the individual. I think at this point we're going to turn our attention to a transcendent creator, the moral argument for God. Now this is important because I think we're going to lay some fairly solid framework for this. Very simple. Laws imply a lawgiver. There is an objective moral law, therefore there is a moral lawgiver. If you want to think about this in more of an academic way, Aristotle came up with something called a syllogism. If premise A is correct and premise B is correct, then premise C naturally must follow. That's really what we're talking about here. If there's a moral lawgiver, laws imply a lawgiver. There is an objective moral law, therefore an objective moral law exists. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. And I would argue tonight that objective moral values and duties do exist, and therefore God exists. If there's such a thing as evil, you must assume there's such a thing as good. That's what we were talking about earlier when we talk about the shadows and the sunshine. The shadows prove the sunshine. You can have a sunny day without shadows. You can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good. You can't have shadows without sunshine. They prove a deficiency of the other. They don't prove the non-existence of it. Actually, in retrospect, they prove it. Does that make sense? It's a little bit backhanded argument for God, but nevertheless, I think it holds up really well. If you assume there's such a thing as good, you assume there's such a thing as an absolute and unchanging moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. If you assume there's such a thing as an absolute moral law, then you must point to absolute moral lawgiver, but that would be God, the one whom the atheist is trying to disprove. So let's rewind. Let's look at this in reverse order for a second. If there's not a moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. Can't complain about evil if there's no such thing as evil. Now, this dilemma, this Greek philosopher, who I'm really not going to try and pronounce his name tonight, we're just going to call him Mr. E. Hope that's okay with everyone, because unless someone else wants to crack a go at this guy's name, I'm not about to. Okay? Is something good because God approves it, or does God approve something because it's good? In other words, what he's saying is, which one came first, the chicken or the egg? That's really the question here. The first makes God arbitrary, the second makes good independent of God. Is something good because God approves it? In other words, is it good because God says it's good, or does God approve of it because it's good? And we're going to resolve this question here in just a moment here. So how do we resolve this? God is the greatest possible being. God's nature is what grounds absolute moral right and wrong. God is intrinsically in himself good, and any deprivation, any subtraction of who he is in and of himself is wrong. So when we're talking about right or wrong, we're not talking about something independent of God. We're talking about something in the absence of God's intrinsic moral value. So God has no obligations to anything outside of himself. Keep in mind, we're talking about this from a moral perspective. I'm not talking about this from a theological perspective. I'm not saying that God doesn't come into human history and he talks to us and that he has covenants and blah, blah, blah. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that for tonight's purposes, this is the way we're looking at it. Those things are also true, but this is not what we're arguing for tonight. God simply acts, and what he naturally does is good because it comes from his nature and his essence, and his nature is good. All right. I'm going to wrap this up here. Actually, I want to just back it up for 1 second because there was a quote that I may have skipped past, and I just wanted to read it to you. It's from J.L. McKee, atheist philosopher, and I'll put this up here so I'm not speaking too heavily into the mic. And this is prior to that Greek philosopher's argument. He says, "We might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, subservient upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are unlikely to have arisen ordinarily events, or without an all-powerful God to create it." Conclusions. Let's just wrap this up. God provides the only objective standard for moral values. God provides the only transcendent authority for enforcing the oughtness of moral duties. Keep in mind that when we're talking about God tonight, when we argue for morality, it's an argument for general theism. It's not an argument necessarily for the God of the Bible. We need to do some more work to get there. Tonight's whole thing is pointing us to theism. Then once we get to theism, we can argue like we're going to do next week, talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But we're talking about a general theism here. But unless we have God here, and for tonight, we're talking about theism, but just for the moment here, I'm going to bring it into the Christian perspective, the Christian foundation. When we talk about theism, we talk about God, when we talk about morals, we're talking about what does he say. If God says something, if he's a lawgiver, what he says is right. It's right for me, it's right for you, it's right for someone here, it's right for someone on the other side of the world, because he's a lawgiver. It's not subjective. And I think as we seek to engage people and have these type of conversations, these are questions that are going to come up fairly regularly. They come up for me, I think they're going to come up for you as well. So keep this in mind as we move forward. Paul talks about always being ready to give a reasoned defense. Peter talks about that in book of 1 Peter, and Paul always talks about him being set for a defense of the gospel. So I think it's important for us to be able to think these things through. Remember, Christ says to his followers, he said, what's the most important thing? Thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And I think sometimes for Christians, we do a really good job of our heart, and we do a great job of our soul, and sometimes we don't do such a great job with our mind. And I would just encourage you to wrestle through some of these questions. We need to be able to engage those people that are going to have questions about this, and then we bring them in and we can explain to them the God of the Bible, how he loves us, how he's created us, how he's made us in his image, and how we have intellect and how we have intrinsic value. And that when we see a pile of bodies up like that, the reason it horrifies us is because it's not just a bunch of biological garbage. They're people created in God's image. And when we see that, that hurts. And so there's importance there. There's a real tangible reason why this stuff is important. So I'm going to wrap things up here. I'm just going to post this up here. If you want to get some more information, I'd be happy to send it to you. Or you can go to Apologetics 3:15. So we'll wrap things up this evening. I'm going to ask Apologetics if he'd come up and pray for us. I want to say a couple of things too. Apologetics and I got together, and it's an important time to be able to get together with friends. And I realize that we're not all coming at this from a Western perspective. I get it. I get the fact that a lot of us may be coming at this from a different cultural perspective. And there's different questions being asked. And so last week and this week and next week, I know it might seem more dry. But these are questions that are being posed to me, and I presume that if we start engaging, that they're going to be posed at us. I think if we have students, we have teachers, we have profs, etc., that as we go into more of a postmodern world and we go into that sort of a framework where everything is relative and words have no meaning, and what's right for you is right for you, and what's right for me is right for me, etc., and nothing means anything. These types of questions are important for us to be able to have a handle on when we're going to engage. So I would just encourage you that, if you have some time to check out some more resources or dig in a little bit, and also dig into the Word. Paul has something to say that I think is so important in Romans. It's important for them. It's important for us. At the end of the day, the human heart really hasn't changed at all. It's probably just gotten a whole lot worse. But the same questions are being asked from the Greeks 2,000 years ago to what we're being asked today.